Tonight we are going to spend some time in 16th century France. It is a world that would feel both familiar and strange to us. People buy bread in crowded markets, children play in narrow streets, travellers move slowly along dusty roads between towns. But it is also a world haunted by things we rarely think about today: plague, famine, religious conflict, and above all, uncertainty. For most people, the future feels dangerous and unknowable. The harvest may fail, disease may arrive without warning, a king may die, a war may begin. In a world like that, anyone who claimed to glimpse the future was bound to attract attention. And no figure became more famous for that claim than a man known to history as Nostradamus. Nearly 500 years after his death, his name remains instantly recognisable. Books continue to be written about him. Television programmes continue to debate his prophecies. Every major crisis seems to produce a fresh wave of claims that Nostradamus predicted it centuries ago. Before the night is over, we will arrive at a tournament in Paris, where a king will die in a way many believed Nostradamus had foreseen years earlier. But that story comes later. Tonight we begin with the man. He was born on the 14th of December, 1503, in a small town in the south of France called Saint-Rémy de Provence. If you have never been to Saint-Rémy, it is worth pausing for a moment to picture it. It sits at the foot of the Alpilles, a small chain of limestone hills that rise sharply from the flat plain of the Creux, their pale rock catching the light in a way that seems to change by the hour. The land around the town is rich with lavender and olive trees, with wild rosemary and thyme growing along the edges of the tracks between fields. The air smells of herbs and dust, and in summer, of heat itself. It was a prosperous town, Saint-Rémy, in a prosperous part of France. The Romans had been there, as they had been almost everywhere in this part of the south. Just outside the town there were ruins, a triumphal arch and a mausoleum, which the local people called Les Antiques. They had been standing there for 1500 years, by the time Michel de Nostredame was born. The children of Saint-Rémy grew up climbing over Roman stones, trailing their hands along carved inscriptions that nobody could fully read. The ruins were simply part of the landscape. They stood beside roads and fields, as they had for centuries, reminding anyone who cared to notice that other lives had been lived here long before their own. The past was never very far away. This is the landscape that shaped the earliest years of his life. Not dramatic, not remote, but old, in a way that the north of France was not quite old, steeped in layers of history that were visible in the ground itself. His family were Jewish, though they had converted to Christianity a generation before his birth. This was not an unusual story in the France of the early 16th century. Jewish communities across Europe had been under sustained pressure for decades, and in the territories of southern France, as elsewhere, many families had converted publicly to Christianity while quietly maintaining elements of their older culture and learning in private. The name they had taken, Nostradame, means Our Lady in French. It was a name chosen to announce faith, to offer reassurance, to smooth the way in a world where the wrong ancestry could make everything harder. Michel had two grandfathers, and both of them mattered enormously to who he became. His maternal grandfather was Jean de Saint-Rémy. Jean was a physician, educated and widely read, with an interest that extended well beyond the medicine of his time. He was the person who first took the child Michel in hand and began his education. He taught him Latin. He taught him Greek. He taught him Hebrew, which was unusual even then, a language associated in many people's minds with the old traditions of the family. He taught him mathematics, and he taught him astrology. In the 16th century, astrology was not considered a separate discipline from medicine or philosophy. It was part of a single way of understanding the world. The movements of the planets and stars were believed to exert a direct influence on the health of the human body, on the rise and fall of kingdoms, on the turning of seasons and the fortunes of individuals. A physician who did not understand the heavens was considered to be working without half his tools. Jean de Saint-Remy understood the heavens, and he passed that understanding to his grandson with patience and with care. On clear nights, the two of them would stand together in the darkness outside the house, and Jean would point upward and name what he saw. He would trace the paths of the planets across the sky. He would explain which configurations were considered favourable and which were not, which stars governed which parts of the body, which movements of the heavens were thought to herald change. And the boy would stand beside him and look up and ask questions that the old man answered as fully as he could and sometimes could not. It was in those nighttime lessons, perhaps, that something was opened in Michel de Nostredame that would never fully close. His other grandfather, Michel de Nostredame, was also an educated man with interests that ranged across medicine, mathematics, and classical learning. Pierre was perhaps more worldly than Jean, more interested in the practical and the commercial dimensions of knowledge. Between them, the two old men gave the boy an education that was unusual for his time and place, broad, deep, multilingual, and rooted in a belief that the world could be understood by patient and careful observation. He was, by all accounts, a quick and hungry student. Languages came to him easily. He absorbed what was put in front of him and asked for more. Those who knew him as a child remembered him as unusual, not in a way that made him strange or difficult, but in a way that made him different, more alert, more curious, more given to long silences, followed by unexpected questions. He was growing up in a world full of things to be curious about. When he was old enough, he was sent to study at Avignon. Avignon was one of the great intellectual cities of southern France. It had served as the seat of the papacy for much of the 14th century, and that history had left it with magnificent libraries, a deep tradition of scholarship, and a civic culture that took learning seriously in a way not every French city of the time did. He studied the classical authors, philosophy, and languages. He was, by accounts from this period, a remarkable student, exceptional in his capacity to absorb material and to see connections between things that other students did not see. He was also, it seems, not always easy. He knew things his teachers had not taught him, and he was not always careful about how he showed it. But Avignon was only the beginning. From there, he moved south and east to Montpellier. The University of Montpellier was, in the early 16th century, one of the finest medical schools in Europe. It attracted students from across the continent, and it had a reputation not just for teaching the classical medical texts of Galen and Hippocrates, but for something more practical and more demanding, for the actual, difficult, sometimes brutal work of treating human beings who were suffering. He arrived at Montpellier in 1522. He was 19 years old. He was ambitious, educated beyond his years, and full of questions that the university would try to answer. But the world, it turned out, had its own curriculum to teach him. The plague had arrived before him. There is almost nothing in the story of Nostradamus that can be understood without first understanding the plague. It had moved through Europe in great waves since the middle of the 14th century, when the Black Death had killed, by some estimates, a third of the population of the continent. That initial catastrophe was a century and a half in the past by the time Michel de Nostredame was a student at Montpellier. But the plague had not gone. It had subsided and then returned and subsided again and returned again, unpredictably, without pattern or warning, arriving in a town and emptying it within weeks before moving on to the next. Nobody understood how it spread. Nobody had a reliable treatment. Nobody could predict when or where it would arrive. People knew only that it came. One household would fall ill, then another. Doors would close. Church bells would ring more often. Streets would grow quieter. Markets would empty. And sometimes entire neighbourhoods seemed to sink into an uneasy silence that could last for weeks before the worst of it passed. During his years at Montpellier, outbreaks of plague forced him to leave the university on more than one occasion. He did not use these interruptions idly. He travelled. He moved through the towns and villages of southern France, learning from the people he encountered along the way, from apothecaries and healers, from anyone who seemed to have practical knowledge that the university had not given him. He was developing his own methods. He believed in fresh air, in cleanliness, in the removal of the sick from contaminated water. He developed preparations of his own, most famously what he called rose pills, made from dried rose petals combined with other plant materials, which he believed offered some protection against the disease. His methods were unconventional by the standards of his training. Some of his professors disapproved, but his results were, repeatedly, and by the standards of his time, remarkable. He stayed in plague-stricken towns when others left. He walked the streets when the disease was active. Contemporary accounts suggest that his patients fared better than those treated by more conventional physicians, though the evidence from this period is fragmentary and not always easy to verify. He returned to Montpellier eventually and completed his studies. He received his license to practice. He was, by any measure, a capable and unusual physician, one who had learned more from experience in the field than most of his contemporaries would accumulate in a lifetime of practice. He set out into the world with his skills and his methods and his hard-won knowledge. He was in his middle 20s. The worst of what life would bring him had not yet arrived. He settled in the late 1520s in the town of Agen in the southwest of France. He married. His wife was from a good family, well connected in Agen, and the match gave him social standing in the town and a comfortable base from which to build his practice. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter. For a few years, this was his life. A practice with patients who sought him out from across the region, a family, a home, a reputation that was growing steadily and that gave him satisfaction. And then the plague came back. It took his wife. It took both of his children. He could not save them. The loss was devastating. As a father, as a husband, as a man who had watched his own family disappear in the space of weeks, the grief was complete and ordinary and terrible, the kind that leaves a mark on everything that comes after. But it was also professionally catastrophic. Here was a man who had built his name, at least in part, on his ability to keep people alive when plague arrived, who had walked into diseased towns and emerged with more of his patients living than any reasonable expectation could have predicted, who had spent years developing methods that he believed and that his results had seemed to support were genuinely more effective than what other physicians offered. And his own wife and children had died. His wife's family withdrew their support. There were whispers, and then something louder than whispers, that a man who could not save his own household was perhaps not the physician his reputation had claimed. He found himself alone in Agen in a way that went beyond the ordinary loneliness of grief. He left. What followed were years of wandering. The records from this period of his life are thin and often contradictory. He moved through France, possibly into Italy, possibly further. Some accounts have him continuing to practice medicine. Others suggest he was simply moving, as people sometimes do when grief is too heavy to carry, while staying still. He was somewhere in his late 20s and early 30s. He had lost his family, his position, and the professional certainty that had sustained him through the difficult years of his training. He was not finished, but it would be some time before he knew that. Sometime in the late 1530s, something in him settled. He returned to Provence. He moved through several towns before coming to rest in Salon de Provence, a quiet and relatively prosperous town sitting between Marseille and Avignon on the flat plain of the Crau. It was not a remarkable town. It was not a centre of intellectual life or political power. But it was solid and comfortable, and far enough from his earlier life to allow him to begin again. He married again. His second wife was a widow named Anne Ponsard, a woman of property and good sense, who would share his life for the rest of it. They would have 6 children together. He was respected in Salon. He practiced medicine, and he practiced it generously, treating patients who could not pay alongside those who could, building the kind of local reputation that sustains a life. He was known as a careful physician and a serious man, and he began to write. The first things he wrote were not prophecies, they were almanacs. Almanacs were enormously popular in the France of the 16th century. They were small, relatively inexpensive books that combined practical information, advice about when to plant crops and when to expect particular weather, with astrological forecasts for the months ahead. What did the movements of the planet suggest about the coming year? What should a careful household prepare for? What planetary configurations governed the health of the body in spring, in summer, in autumn and winter? Every educated household wanted one. There was a modest industry of writers producing them, and the quality varied enormously. Some were little more than superficial entertainment. Others drew on serious astrological scholarship and commanded genuine respect. Nostradamus, as he had now begun to call himself, the Latinized form of the family name Nostradame, proved to be very good at writing almanacs. His were well composed, interestingly conceived, and they sold. He published one every year through the 1540s and into the 1550s, and his readership grew steadily. The printing press had made this kind of gradual, widening reputation possible in a way that would not have been conceivable 100 years earlier. A writer in Salon de Provence in 1450 would have had almost no means of reaching readers more than a few miles away. In 1550, his books could travel to Paris, to Lyon, to Rouen, to cities he would never visit in his life. His name spread ahead of him, carried by ink and paper through a Europe that was hungry for exactly the kind of authoritative, thoughtful, astrologically grounded guidance he was offering. The appetite was there, and over time, something in him grew to meet it. In 1555, he published the first edition of what would become his most famous work. He called it Les Prophéties, the prophecies. It was a collection of poems arranged in groups of 100, which he called centuries. Each poem was 4 lines long. He called these 4-line poems quatrains. The first edition contained 3 complete centuries and part of a 4th. Later editions, revised and expanded, would eventually bring the total to nearly 1,000 quatrains. The poems were extraordinary things, and not because they were straightforward or clear. They were written in a language that was deliberately difficult, even for the educated readers of his own time. Nostradamus mixed Old French with Latin, with Greek, with invented words, with anagram, with symbol and metaphor, layered on top of further symbol and metaphor. He scrambled the order of events. He described things in terms so indirect and so layered that the same 4 lines could, without too much effort, be made to refer to dozens of different events in dozens of different centuries. Why write this way? Part of the answer is practical. Nostradamus lived in a world in which claiming to see the future was a dangerous business. A man who too specifically named kings and dates and outcomes risked being accused of witchcraft or heresy or consorting with forces that no good Christian should approach. A prophet who spoke plainly was a prophet who could be prosecuted. A poet who wrote in symbols, who offered images rather than facts, who left interpretation open, was far harder to pin down. The obscurity was, at least in part, a kind of armour. But there is perhaps another answer, and a more interesting one. Nostradamus described his method in a letter to his son Caesar, which he prefaced to one of the later editions of the Prophecies. He wrote of receiving his visions in the night hours, in a state between sleeping and waking, through methods that drew on the traditions of ancient divination. He described a brass tripod, like the one used by the oracle at Delphi. He described fire and water and a kind of trance in which images came that he then set himself to record. Whether those visions were genuine glimpses of the future or the products of an extraordinary imagination working with the deep symbolic vocabulary of his time is a question we cannot answer, but they were real to him. The strangeness and the density of the quatrains reflects the strangeness of the experience he was trying to set down. They were not meant to be simple. They were not meant to be read quickly, in good light, with everything explained. They were meant to be lived with, slowly, by people willing to sit with uncertainty. They were a portrait of how the future appeared when you tried to look at it directly. Partial, shifting, slipping away whenever you thought you understood them. Whether that is prophecy or poetry, or something that cannot be cleanly divided into either category, is a question the centuries have not yet settled. The quatrains spread quickly through the reading public of France and beyond. In Paris, in Lyon, in the great houses and the royal court, people read them and debated them. What did they mean? Which events did they refer to? Had some of them already come to pass? And then, in 1556, something happened that lifted Nostradamus out of the merely famous and into the realm of the extraordinary. Catherine de' Medici sent for him. Catherine was the Italian-born Queen of France, wife of King Henry II, and a woman of formidable intelligence and political instinct. She was also a woman who believed in astrology, who had surrounded herself with advisors and seers of various kinds, and who took the question of what the future held with deadly seriousness. She had read the quatrains. They had interested her, and she wanted to meet the man who had written them. Nostradamus travelled to Paris. He was received at the royal court. He met Catherine, and possibly the king himself, and various members of the royal family, including the royal children, whose futures lay ahead of them like unread books. The precise content of those conversations is not recorded in any source we can fully trust. What we know is that the meeting went well, that Catherine formed a positive view of him, that she would remain a supporter and patron for the rest of his life. He returned to Salon a different kind of famous, not merely a popular almanac writer and author of curious poems. The Queen of France knew his name. And then, the following year, the event occurred that would define his reputation for the next 5 centuries. It is the 29th of June, 1559. King Henry II of France is attending a jousting tournament in Paris, held on the Rue Saint-Antoine, in the heart of the city. It is a celebration. A peace treaty has recently been signed with Spain, ending years of costly conflict, and the festivities are a way of marking that peace and displaying the health and confidence of the French crown. The king is in fine spirits. He is 40 years old, vigorous and experienced at the joust. He has competed many times. There is no particular reason for anyone present to feel anxious. He rides against Gabriel de Montgomery, a Scottish nobleman who serves as a captain of the king's own guard. They have already run 2 passes against each other without incident. On the 3rd pass, something shifts. There is the sudden crack of splintering wood, a flash of movement, then confusion. Montgomery's lance had struck the king's golden visor at an angle. The lance shatters on impact. A splinter of wood passes through the visor and into the king's eye. Another fragment wounds his throat. Henry II was carried from the field. Surgeons were summoned from across France and beyond. Every effort was made to save him. He lingered for 10 days. He died on the 10th of July, in agony, of the infection that followed his wounds. France was stunned. The death was senseless and sudden, and came at a moment of celebration, which made it feel almost like a mockery. A king struck down at his own festival of peace, and people began to look at the quatrains. In the 1st century of Les Prophéties, the 35th quatrain, they found these lines. The young lion will overcome the older one on the field of combat in a single battle. He will pierce his eyes in a golden cage. 2 wounds become 1, then he dies a cruel death. The interpretation seemed to offer itself. The young lion was Montgomery. The older lion was Henry, who bore a lion on his coat of arms. The golden cage was the golden visor. The 2 wounds that become 1 referred to the way the lance had shattered, creating multiple injuries that combined into a fatal outcome. And the cruel death described the 10 days of agony that followed. Whether quatrain 35 of century 1 genuinely predicted the death of Henry II is a question we will examine in careful and rigorous detail in a later episode. There are important things to say about how the quatrains work, about the nature of interpretation, and about the specific evidence surrounding this particular prediction. But tonight, what matters is the effect. The effect was immediate, and it was total. Nostradamus had been famous before the death of Henry II. After it, he was something else entirely. He was the man who had predicted the death of the King of France. In print, years before it happened, letters arrived in Salon from across Europe. His books were reprinted and sold as fast as they could be produced. Rulers and nobles and wealthy merchants and ordinary readers, who had never previously given much thought to prophecy, found themselves uncertain, found themselves drawn to the quatrains, found themselves willing to entertain the possibility that this man from Provence had seen something that ought not to have been seeable. For the remaining years of his life, his reputation spread further than he could ever have imagined. He did not flourish in that fame. By the time Henry died in the summer of 1559, Nostradamus was 55 years old. He was not a well man. He suffered from gout, a painful condition that affected his joints and made movement increasingly difficult. In his final years, the gout worsened considerably. He was confined to his home for long periods. He could not always stand. He continued to work. He continued to produce almanacs. He answered as many letters as he could, though the volume was now overwhelming. He was consulted by nobles and merchants and ordinary people who wrote from cities he would never visit, asking him questions about their futures that he answered with varying degrees of confidence and obscurity. In 1564, Catherine de' Medici came to Salon herself. She was making a grand tour of France, an extended royal progress through the kingdom, and she arranged her route to include the town where Nostradamus lived. She visited him at his home. He was too ill to stand for the full duration of the audience, but she came to him. It was, in its way, an extraordinary moment. The queen of the most powerful country in Europe, adjusting her itinerary to call on an aging, gout-ridden physician from Provence because she valued his opinion and wanted to hear what he had to say. He told those close to him, in the early months of 1566, that he did not expect to live much longer. On the evening of the 1st of July, 1566, his secretary came to say goodnight. Nostradamus told him that he would not see him alive in the morning. On the morning of the 2nd of July, he was found dead in his study, beside his workbench. He was 62 years old. He was buried in the Church of the Cordeliers in Salon de Provence. His epitaph, which he apparently composed himself, described him as worthy of the stars. More than 200 years after his death, during the upheaval of the French Revolution, his tomb was disturbed. The story that passed down through the years says that soldiers who opened his coffin were struck with misfortune not long afterwards. Whether that story is true or simply the kind of legend that accretes around a figure like Nostradamus, the way moss accretes around old stone, is now impossible to know. His remains were eventually moved to the Collegiate Church of Saint-Laurent in Salon, where they rest today. The town of Salon de Provence remembers him. There is a museum in the house where he lived and worked. Visitors come from across the world to stand in the rooms where he wrote his quatrains, to look at the instruments and the books and the small domestic objects that surrounded him during the years when he was, by any reasonable measure, the most discussed man in Europe. It is natural, having followed him from his birth in the lavender-scented hills to his death in a study in Salon, to stop and ask the question that has never really been answered. Was he a genuine prophet? The honest answer is that we do not know. 5 centuries have passed since Nostradamus sat at his desk in Provence and wrote his strange 4-line poems. The evidence we possess is incomplete, the interpretations often disputed, and certainty remains elusive. What we can say is this: the quatrains are real. They exist. They were written in the 1550s and published before the events that people have since found in them. That is not in dispute. What is in dispute is the question of interpretation. The quatrains are deliberately obscure. They use language that can support multiple readings. They describe images rather than specific events. And human beings are extraordinary at finding meaning in ambiguous material, especially when the events are already known, and the task is to find the text that matches them. This is not a dismissal of Nostradamus. It is an honest description of the interpretive challenge that his work presents. There is also this: some of the correspondences between the quatrains and later events are genuinely striking. They are not all equally convincing. Some require considerable effort to maintain, but others are harder to explain away entirely. And it is worth sitting with that difficulty rather than resolving it too quickly in either direction. The question of what Nostradamus actually saw and what the evidence genuinely shows deserves careful attention. It will receive that attention in the episodes that follow. But for tonight, I want to end with a different question. Not whether his prophecies were real, but why they endure. Why, nearly 500 years after his death, does his name still carry weight? Why does every crisis produce a new wave of people searching his quatrains for something that matches what has just happened? Why do his books keep selling, his name keep appearing, his image keep returning? Part of the answer is the quality of the work itself. Even in translation, even stripped of their original French, the quatrains have a particular atmosphere. They feel old in a way that gets under the skin. They resist easy summary. They offer images that stay in the mind without explaining themselves. Images, unlike arguments, do not become outdated in the same way. Part of the answer is the structure of the work. Nearly 1,000 quatrains, written in deliberately ambiguous language, covering an enormous range of images and symbols. Given enough material and enough ambiguity, it is possible to find some correspondence between almost any event in history and something in that body of work. This is not a criticism. It is a description of how pattern recognition operates in a mind looking for meaning. We are creatures who find significance in coincidence. We hear a story and we immediately begin searching for the moment when the story was already written somewhere, already waiting to be found. Nostradamus understood this, perhaps better than almost anyone. He may have built his work around it, or he may simply have been doing something else entirely, something we do not yet have quite the right language to describe, and the pattern recognition has followed him like a shadow ever since. And then there is the third reason, which is perhaps the most honest of all. We live in a world that still feels uncertain. The harvests do not fail in the way they did in the 16th century. The plague does not move through our towns and empty them in a fortnight. But the underlying feeling that the future is dark and that something large and difficult may be coming, that feeling has not gone anywhere. It was there in 1503 when Michel de Nostredame was born. It was there in 1566 when he died. It has been there in every century since. And in every generation, there are people who turn to figures like Nostradamus, not because they are certain the prophecies are real, but because they want to feel that someone, somewhere, at some point, was not afraid to look at the darkness and describe what they saw there. That someone sat with the uncertainty and held it steadily and tried to put it into words. That is not a small thing. Tonight, we have traced the life of the man. We began in the warm south of France, with a curious child learning Latin and Greek and the names of the stars from a grandfather who believed that the sky and the body and the turning of seasons were all part of one great legible system. We followed him through the hard years of his education, through the plague-stricken towns where he learned more than any classroom could have taught him. We were there when he lost his first family to the very disease he had dedicated himself to understanding. We walked with him through the years of wandering that followed. We saw him arrive in Salon de Provence and begin again. We watched the almanacs give way to something larger. We were there when the quatrains first appeared in print, when they spread across a continent hungry for exactly what they offered. We stood in Paris in the summer of 1559 and felt the world shift when a lance shattered and a king fell. And we ended as he ended, in a quiet study in Salon de Provence, on a summer morning in 1566, with the work finished and the stars still turning overhead as they always had. There is more to say. There is always more to say about Nostradamus. In the next episode, we will turn to the quatrains themselves, what they are, how they work, what Nostradamus believed he was doing when he wrote them, and why the question of how to read them has fascinated and divided people for nearly 500 years. And after that, we will begin to examine them one by one. But for tonight, this is enough. Let the image stay with you, if it will. A house in Provence. A man sitting at a desk in the hours before dawn. Candlelight moving softly across the walls. The town asleep around him. stars above the rooftops, a pen moving slowly across a page. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marking the hour. The future still unwritten, or perhaps already written, and a man trying to read it. Whatever he saw, he looked at it steadily, and he wrote it down. Sleep well.